Welcome to the War Files Hub, where wars become stories. Vladimir Putin's life did not start with power or with knowing for sure that he would one day lead the biggest country on earth. He was born in 1952 in Leningrad, a city still showing deep damage from World War II. The memory of the siege of Leningrad, one of the longest and most terrible battles in history, hung over every building, every family, every memory. His father was a sailor and factory worker who was part of a group of people made tough by war and hard times. His mother had already lived through the starvation of the siege. Out of 3 sons, Putin would be the only one to live past childhood. His early years in a small shared apartment were marked less by comfort and more by survival, rules, and toughness. He was a quiet child, but restless. Stories of Soviet heroes and secret agents fascinated him. By the time he reached college, his eyes were already set on the secret halls of the KGB. In a world built on secrets, loyalty, and toughness, Putin found a place that matched who he was. He joined the KGB and was sent to East Germany during the Cold War, where he learned the art of quiet watching, of playing roles, of moving unnoticed through places of power. These years trained him not only in spying but also in patience, waiting for the right moment to act. The Soviet Union was a huge empire, but by the 1980s, it was also an empire falling apart. Bad leadership ate at its core, different groups wanted freedom in its republics, and its world's standing began to fall. As a young officer, Putin must have felt this shakiness. He was trained to serve a superpower, but he returned to a homeland that was breaking apart. The collapse of the USSR in 1991 was not just a political event. It was an earthquake that shattered millions of lives. Ordinary Russians lost their savings, their jobs, their sense of belonging. The army fell apart. Retirement money disappeared. Crime groups grew strong. For many, the 1990s were not years of freedom, but years of shame. And yet, in this mess, Putin climbed. While rich businessmen and politicians fought each other in Moscow, he worked quietly in St. Petersburg's city government, proving himself loyal, skilled, and most importantly, useful. It was this reputation that eventually brought him to the attention of Boris Yeltsin, the struggling president of the Russian Federation. Yeltsin's health was failing, his popularity dropping, and his circle of friends shrinking. He needed men who could be trusted, men who were quiet, quick to decide, and not yet burdened by too much fame. Putin fit the role perfectly. But it was not simply office skill that would bring him to the top of Russian power. It was war. Specifically, a war on Russia's own land, one that would fill headlines, test the strength of the Russian state, and give Putin the stage to build his image as the nation's hero. The Chechen Wars, brutal and never-ending, would become the testing ground where his political future was shaped. Chechnya was a small republic in the Caucasus, an area as rough in its land as in its history. Mountains carved natural fortresses. Valleys held centuries-old traditions of fighting back. And a proud people held on to independence against invaders from every time period, whether they were Tsarist armies, Soviet leaders, or Russian generals. The fight for Chechnya was never simply about land. It was about identity, dignity, and survival. And so as Russia stumbled through the 1990s, Chechnya rose in defiance. Yeltsin's government, already shaken, saw this as a life-or-death threat. If one republic could break away, others might follow, and the fragile federation would fall apart. The Chechen question became not just a military problem, but a political one. A question of whether Russia itself could stay whole. Into this dangerous situation stepped Putin, a man little known to the public at the time, but already sharpening his instincts on how to turn crisis into opportunity. He understood what Yeltsin did not. That war, though tragic, could be changed into a stage for leadership. The Chechen conflict would not only define Russia's future, it would define Putin himself. As the decade drew to a close, Russia stood at a crossroads. One path led deeper into chaos, breaking apart, and weakness. The other promised order, strength, and the return of national pride, no matter the cost. It was in this moment of uncertainty that Vladimir Putin began to emerge from the shadows. When the red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered for the last time in December 1991, Russia entered unknown waters. The empire that had ruled half the globe was gone. and in its place stood a weak group of republics, each struggling to find its place in a world that no longer followed the same rules. The promises of freedom and democracy were exciting to some, but to many Russians, the early 1990s were remembered as a time of confusion and sadness. Boris Yeltsin, the first president of the Russian Federation, was at the head of this storm. At first, he was praised as a revolutionary figure, the man who had stood on a tank in Moscow during the failed August coup of 1991, standing up to hardline communists and symbolizing the dawn of a new Russia. Yet, victory and symbolism did not translate into stability and leadership. The Russian economy collapsed. Factories closed, wages went unpaid, and rising prices destroyed savings overnight. A generation that had known security, however strict, under Soviet rule, now found itself searching in the ruins of an economic collapse. In this atmosphere of chaos, old wounds reopened. For the republics of the Caucasus, Chechnya chief among them, the fall of the Soviet Union was a chance to demand long-suppressed desires for self-rule. Chechens had a long history of fighting back against Russian authority, stretching back to the brutal wars of the 19th century when Tsar's generals fought campaigns to crush their independence. During the Soviet era, Joseph Stalin had forced nearly 500,000 Chechens to move to Central Asia in 1944, accusing them of working with Nazi Germany. Thousands died in that forced exile. Although they were later allowed to return under Khrushchev, the memory of betrayal and survival never left them. So when Moscow's grip weakened in the 1990s, Chechnya seized its chance. In 1991, a former Soviet Air Force general named Jakhar Dudayev declared the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria independent. Chechnya was small, landlocked, and desperately poor, but it carried itself with fierce pride. Dudayev promised his people freedom from Russian control. But independence came at a price. The sudden lack of oversight from Moscow turned Chechnya into a haven for corruption, smuggling, and organized crime. Kidnappings for ransom became a terrible industry. What had been imagined as a beacon of independence began to look like a lawless frontier. For Yeltsin, this was a nightmare. The Russian Federation was stitched together from dozens of regions, each with its own identity. If Chechnya could break away successfully, what was to stop Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, or even Siberia from following? The loss of one republic might start a chain reaction that would unravel the entire federation. Yeltsin's government was weak, but he could not afford to appear weak. At first, Yeltsin tried secret means. In late 1994, he sent disguised Russian forces to support opposition militias in Chechnya, hoping to topple Dudayev's government without open conflict. The plan failed. Embarrassed, Yeltsin abandoned the pretense and launched a full-scale military intervention. He expected a quick and clear victory, a show of force that would remind the rest of the republics that Moscow still ruled. Instead, he found himself facing the beginning of a long and bloody nightmare. In December 1994, Russian tanks rolled toward Grozny, the Chechen capital. On paper, the Russian army greatly outnumbered and had better weapons than the Chechen defenders. But the reality was very different. The Russian forces suffered from poor coordination, inadequate training, and collapsing morale. Chechen fighters, led by experienced veterans of the Soviet-Afghan War, knew the land, the tactics, and the art of fighting a much bigger enemy. They fought not for wages or orders, but for their homeland. As Russian columns entered Grozny, they were attacked from high-rise buildings, their tanks pushed into narrow streets that became killing zones. The city turned into a maze of death. What Yeltsin hoped would be a quick operation became a drawn-out disaster. Soldiers sent to Grozny were shocked by how fierce the resistance was. Mothers in Russia began receiving the bodies of their sons shipped back in metal coffins. By 1995, the war had consumed both nations. For Russia, it was a humiliation. A superpower unable to defeat a small breakaway republic. For Chechnya, it was destruction. Villages flattened, families shattered, and a society pushed to the edge. Yet, even under bombardment, Chechen fighters refused to surrender. The First Chechen War would end not in Russian victory, but in stalemate. Yeltsin's government, exhausted, was forced to negotiate. The Khasavyurt Accords of 1996 ended open conflict, granting Chechnya de facto independence, but leaving its legal status unresolved. To many Russians, this was seen as a national disgrace. To many Chechens, it was only a temporary break. Both sides knew the fragile peace would not last. In the meantime, Yeltsin's own health was failing. By the late 1990s, he was visibly weakened by heart problems and alcoholism. His government staggered from one crisis to another, surviving only through political deals and the support of rich businessmen. Russia seemed rulerless, adrift in chaos. It was in this vacuum, between a weakened president and a broken nation, that a new figure began to emerge. His name was Vladimir Putin. When Russian tanks first rumbled into Chechnya in December 1994, Moscow expected a show of strength, not a long war. The Kremlin's generals promised Boris Yeltsin that the operation would last only a few days, that Grozny would be captured, Jakhar Dudayev toppled, and order restored. For a president desperate to show authority, it seemed a simple solution to a complex problem. Yet what followed would expose the decay within Russia's military, the fierceness of Chechen resistance, and the deep scars of empire. The Russian advance began with air raids. Bombers and helicopters unleashed destruction upon Grozny, black smoke rising from the capital skyline. The plan was to weaken the defenders before armored columns moved in. But the Chechens were not scared. Veterans of the Soviet-Afghan War had already turned the city into a fortress. Mines were laid in roads, sniper nests set up in apartment blocks, and ambush points mapped with care. To the Chechens, Grozny was not just a capital. It was their heart. And it would be defended street by street, floor by floor. On New Year's Eve 1994, Russian forces launched their attack. Tanks rolled into the city in columns, but the narrow streets became traps. From above, Chechen fighters rained down fire with rocket-propelled grenades, turning armored vehicles into burning wrecks. Entire Russian units found themselves cut off, surrounded in the maze of the city. Young soldiers, barely trained and with little understanding of why they were even there, were thrown into a nightmare of city combat. The Russian high command had underestimated not only the land but the will of their enemy. As days stretched into weeks, the battle for Grozny became a slaughterhouse. The Russian army's lack of coordination was obvious. Units advanced without communication. Air strikes sometimes fell on their own troops, and soldiers went into battle without enough food or winter clothing. Meanwhile, the Chechens took advantage of every weakness. Fighters appeared suddenly from basements, then vanished into tunnels. They disguised themselves in stolen Russian uniforms, slipping past checkpoints at night. Every intersection was a battlefield, every building a possible stronghold. Among the Chechen leadership, two figures became especially feared by the Russians. President Dudayev, though the political head of state, was also a skilled military planner. He used his knowledge of Soviet methods to predict Russian moves and counter them effectively. Then there was Shamil Basayev, a commander whose ruthless tactics and strong will turned him into both a hero to some Chechens and a terrorist in the eyes of Russia. Basayev had trained with foreign fighters, gaining connections that would later shape Chechnya's struggle in darker ways. The Russians eventually captured Grozny, but their victory was empty. Chechen forces simply melted into the countryside, launching ambushes, raids, and guerrilla attacks that bled the Russians dry. Entire convoys were destroyed in mountain passes. Helicopters were shot down by portable missiles. Each week, Russian television showed more funerals, more grieving mothers holding the photographs of sons who had never returned from the Caucasus. Public opinion began to turn sharply against the war. By 1995, the conflict had turned into a grinding stalemate. Russia had overwhelming firepower, artillery, tanks, aircraft, but it could not break the will of the Chechens. The cost was huge. Grozny was reduced to rubble with entire districts flattened by bombing. Tens of thousands of civilians were caught in the crossfire, their homes destroyed, their families shattered. The Kremlin insisted it was fighting bandits and criminals, but the reality was clear. Russia was at war with a people determined not to be defeated. The war also showed the weakness of the Russian state itself. Corruption filled the army. Soldiers were sometimes sent into combat without proper weapons, forced to search for supplies. Officers sold fuel and ammunition on the black market. Stories spread of units abandoned by their commanders, left to fend for themselves in dangerous territory. For many Russians, this was a humiliation. A superpower brought low, not by NATO or a foreign enemy, but by a small republic with fewer than 1 million people. By 1996, the war had become impossible to continue. The Russian army was exhausted, morale shattered, and international criticism mounting. That summer, Chechen fighters retook Grozny in a stunning attack, overwhelming Russian positions and forcing Moscow to the negotiating table. The Khasavyurt Accords were signed in August, effectively ending the war. They granted Chechnya de facto independence, though its final status remained unclear. For the Chechens, it was a moment of victory, proof that they could defy a giant and win. For Russia, it was a bitter humiliation. Yeltsin's leadership was discredited, his military exposed as weak, his nation humiliated before the world. In the streets of Moscow, people spoke of a government unable to protect its soldiers, let alone restore Russia's greatness. But even as the ink dried on the peace agreement, there was an unspoken understanding on both sides. This was not the end. It was only an intermission. The scars of the First Chechen War would fester, and in the shadows, men like Putin would watch, waiting for their chance to turn chaos into opportunity. The First Chechen War ended not with victory, but with a bitter compromise. The Khasavyurt Accords of 1996 forced Moscow to withdraw its beaten army, leaving Grozny in ruins, yet still defiantly Chechen. Russia, humiliated, had been forced to negotiate with the very men it had called terrorists and bandits. For Boris Yeltsin, the timing was important. An election was coming, and ending the war, no matter the cost, was necessary to save what little political trust remained. For Russia as a whole, however, the withdrawal was nothing short of disgrace. The images broadcast to the world were burned into memory. Russian columns limping home, convoys of wounded soldiers. The flag of Ichkeria flying defiantly above the ruins of Grozny. The Russian military, once feared across Eastern Europe, had been exposed as clumsy, underfunded, and demoralized. The image of Soviet-era strength was gone. In its place was a hollow shell riddled with corruption and incompetence. At home, Yeltsin's popularity collapsed. His drinking, his health, and his unpredictable leadership became the subject of mockery. Russians watched in despair as their nation, which had once competed with the United States for world leadership, now stumbled from one crisis to the next. Rising prices destroyed families, rich businessmen stole state property, and organized crime spread like wildfire. In the popular imagination, Chechnya came to symbolize everything that was wrong with the Russian state: weakness, disunity, and shame. Meanwhile, Chechnya itself was far from a victorious paradise. The destruction of war had left the republic in ruins. Grozny was often described as looking like Hiroshima after the atomic bomb, an expanse of twisted steel, shattered concrete, and broken lives. The republic had no stable economy, no working institutions, and no clear future. Yet amidst the destruction, independence had been won, at least for the moment. But freedom quickly soured. In the absence of a strong central government, Chechnya fell into chaos. Criminal gangs grew strong. Kidnappings became a terrible industry. Foreigners, journalists, even Russians passing through the region were kidnapped and held for ransom. The republic became known for lawlessness. Some leaders tried to build a working state, but warlords held more power than ministers. Religious extremism also began to take root as foreign fighters and ideologues who had come to help Chechnya during the war stayed behind, spreading radical interpretations of Islam that clashed with the region's older, more traditional practices. The uneasy peace left both Moscow and Grozny in a strange bind. Russia could not accept the idea of a permanently independent Chechnya. Yet it lacked the strength to reclaim it. Chechnya, meanwhile, enjoyed symbolic independence but was too broken to govern effectively. Both sides waited, watched, and armed themselves for the inevitable showdown to come. For Yeltsin, the humiliation of the war sped up his decline. By the late 1990s, his presidency was hanging by a thread. He shuffled prime ministers, clashed with parliament, and upset much of the public. His health got worse. His dependence on alcohol worsened. The Kremlin became less a seat of power than a battlefield for rich businessmen and political groups maneuvering for influence. Each was determined to position themselves for the post-Yeltsin era, for it was clear the president would not last much longer. And yet within this chaos, new opportunities were being created. A quiet figure, once an unknown KGB officer, now rising through the ranks of the Kremlin government, was proving himself invaluable. He understood how to move through corruption without drowning in it. How to serve the needs of Yeltsin's allies while quietly building his own power base. His name was Vladimir Putin. And though few Russians yet knew it, he would soon become the central figure of their nation's future. The First Chechen War had left Russia humiliated, Chechnya destroyed, and the Federation's unity in danger. But history rarely ends with humiliation. It demands a response. For Russia, that response would come at the dawn of the new millennium, and it would be led by a man who had spent his life waiting in the shadows, ready to step forward when the nation most craved order. By the late 1990s, Russia was a country adrift. The dream of democracy had turned into cynicism, and the chaos of the post-Soviet years had hollowed out the state. Boris Yeltsin, once praised as the man who brought freedom to Russia, was visibly collapsing under the weight of scandal, alcoholism, and illness. In this crumbling political landscape, the question of who would take over became urgent. Who would inherit the Kremlin? And could they restore authority to a broken nation? The answer, unexpectedly, was a man most Russians had never heard of. Vladimir Putin had spent most of his career in the shadows. A mid-ranking officer of the KGB, he served quietly in East Germany during the Cold War, far from the glamorous postings of Moscow or Washington. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Putin, like so many in the security services, found himself adrift. But unlike many who struggled in the new capitalist jungle, Putin adapted. He returned to St. Petersburg, where his cool manner and tireless loyalty earned him a place in the mayor's office. There he built a reputation as a disciplined worker who got things done without fuss, and more importantly, without drawing too much attention to himself. This quiet way was exactly what Moscow's powerful elite needed. By the mid-1990s, Russia's oligarchs, men who had seized vast fortunes during the privatization of state property, were locked in a ruthless struggle to control the Kremlin. Yeltsin, weakened and unpredictable, was their fragile shield against political rivals who wanted to rein them in. They needed someone who could protect them, someone reliable, obedient, and unknown enough not to cause resistance. Putin fit the role like a glove. In 1997, Yeltsin promoted him to the Kremlin administration, giving him oversight of government property management. Soon after, Putin was tasked with investigating corruption, a dangerous role in a country where corruption was not an exception but the very structure of power. Yet Putin pursued his investigations selectively. Enemies of Yeltsin and his allies often found themselves exposed, while friends remained untouched. It was not just loyalty. It was strategy. Each investigation built connections, earned favors, and deepened his network inside the Kremlin. He was learning how power in Russia truly worked, not through speeches or elections, but through compromise, leverage, and silence. By 1998, Putin's careful maneuvering paid off. He was appointed director of the Federal Security Service, the successor to the KGB. Now he commanded the same system of surveillance, intelligence, and control that had once ruled Soviet life. His name was still unfamiliar to most Russians, but in Moscow's corridors of power, he was no longer invisible. The following year, Yeltsin shocked the nation by firing yet another prime minister, his fourth in just 18 months. In desperation, he turned to Putin, elevating him to the role in August 1999. For many observers, it seemed absurd. The country was on the edge of collapse, and now an unknown former spy was running the government. In the newspapers, Putin was described as a nobody, a placeholder who would soon be replaced like all the others. But those who underestimated him failed to see what he saw: opportunity. Russia was tired of chaos, tired of economic collapse, tired of corruption, tired of humiliation. The public longed for order, for strength, for a leader who could restore pride. Putin recognized this hunger. What he needed was a stage, an event that would allow him to transform from an unknown government worker into a figure of authority. That stage was already taking shape. In the mountains of the North Caucasus, the men who had humiliated Russia during the First Chechen War were preparing their next move. The Peace of Kosovyurt was crumbling, and war was about to return. This time, however, Russia would not be led by a fading Yeltsin. It would be led by a man who understood the power of conflict to shape identity and legitimacy. The rise of Vladimir Putin was no accident. It was the product of calculation, timing, and the never-ending chaos of the 1990s. But it was war, the Second Chechen War, that would provide the testing ground in which his image as Russia's strongman would be forged. In the late summer of 1999, Russia's fragile peace shattered once more. The First Chechen War had left Chechnya battered but unbowed, a republic in ruins yet still fiercely independent. But within its mountains and valleys, new fires were being lit. Fires that threatened to spread beyond its borders. Shamil Basayev, already infamous for his role in the First War, was no longer content with defending Chechnya's independence. Alongside him stood Ibn al-Khattab, a Saudi-born militant who had brought with him not only battlefield experience from Afghanistan but also a strict vision of jihad. Together they set their sights on the neighboring Russian Republic of Dagestan. Their goal was huge, to establish a new Islamic state uniting Chechnya and Dagestan, governed not by Moscow's laws but by Sharia. On August 7, 1999, their forces, numbering around 1,400, poured across the border. Villages in Dagestan awoke to the thunder of trucks, the cries of fighters, and the crack of gunfire. To many locals, the invasion was both terrifying and confusing. Some Dagestani villagers resisted fiercely. Others were caught between loyalty to Moscow and sympathy for their fellow Caucasians. For the Russian state, however, this was an open act of war. In Moscow, Vladimir Putin had only just been appointed prime minister. He was still little more than a name to most Russians, a government worker suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Yet here was the crisis he had been waiting for. Where Yeltsin had hesitated, Putin would show determination. He presented himself as the man who would restore order, crush terrorism, and defend the Russian homeland. The Russian response was overwhelming. Within weeks, nearly 20,000 troops were sent to Dagestan. Artillery thundered across the valleys, airstrikes pounded mountain positions, and armored columns rolled into the contested villages. For the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia moved with speed and confidence. Putin himself took personal control, presenting an image of decisive leadership in contrast to Yeltsin's wavering style. The battles were fierce. Dagestani villagers, armed and organized into militias, joined Russian soldiers in resisting Basayev and Khattab's men. The invaders, though motivated and skilled, found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. By September, their dream of a Chechen Dagestani Islamic Republic was in ruins. Russian firepower had crushed their advance, and survivors retreated back across the border. For Putin, the timing could not have been more perfect. The Dagestan invasion allowed him to step out from Yeltsin's shadow and into the public eye. State television showed him visiting the troops, his language sharp and firm. Russia, he declared, would not allow itself to be torn apart. His words resonated deeply in a country exhausted by weakness and humiliation. For ordinary Russians, weary of seeing their nation mocked and diminished, here at last was a leader who spoke with certainty. Yet the battle for Dagestan was only the beginning. Even as Russian troops secured the republic, a new and darker chapter was about to unfold. In the cities of Russia itself, death was coming, not from soldiers on the battlefield but from bombs planted in the heart of civilian life. These attacks would transform Putin from a temporary figure into the symbol of Russian strength and would push the country into the Second Chechen War. In early September 1999, as Russian forces celebrated their victory in Dagestan, a new terror struck at the very heart of Russia, far from the mountains of the Caucasus, far from the battlefield. It came in the dead of night when families were asleep, when Moscow, Bayansk, and Volgodonsk lay quiet beneath the weight of ordinary life. The first explosion tore through an apartment block in Bayansk on September 4. The blast reduced the building to rubble, killing dozens of men, women, and children in an instant. 4 days later, on September 9, Moscow itself was rocked. A 9-story apartment building on Gurianov Street collapsed into dust and twisted steel, burying hundreds alive. 2 days after that, another building in Moscow was destroyed, killing more than 100 people. On September 16, Volgodonsk was hit. The death toll climbed relentlessly, 293 civilians killed, more than 1,000 injured. For ordinary Russians, the horror was beyond words. Families huddled in fear, convinced their own homes might be next. Rumors swirled, paranoia spread, and cities fell into a state of quiet panic. People began patrolling their neighborhoods at night, forming citizen watch groups. In apartment blocks, residents inspected basements for strange sacks of powder or wires. Russia, already weakened by years of chaos, now felt vulnerable in its most personal spaces. Almost immediately, blame was directed toward Chechen militants. The government announced that the attacks showed the fingerprints of Ibn al-Khattab and Shamil Basayev, the same men who had invaded Dagestan. To many Russians, the connection seemed obvious. If they could strike in Dagestan, why not in Moscow? State media repeated the story relentlessly. The people responsible were Chechens. The threat was Chechnya itself. But the bombings carried more than fear. They sparked rage. The deaths of innocents, families torn apart in their sleep, produced a fury that demanded payback. In television broadcasts, a new figure emerged to channel that fury. Vladimir Putin, calm, sharp, and merciless in tone. He promised justice. He spoke of hunting terrorists wherever they may be found. In his now famous phrase, even in the outhouse. For a people exhausted by weakness, these words rang like steel. Putin's popularity skyrocketed overnight. The little-known government worker, until recently dismissed as a temporary prime minister, was suddenly a national leader. He embodied action, decisiveness, revenge. Russians saw in him what they longed for, a man unafraid to strike back. Yet shadows linger over the bombings to this day. Whispers spread almost immediately. Were all of the explosions truly the work of Chechen militants? Some suspected that the attacks had been orchestrated, or at least exploited, by elements within the Russian security services to justify a new war. The discovery of a suspicious training exercise in Ryazan, where local police found sacks of explosives in an apartment basement, only deepened the mystery. Officials later claimed it was a drill, but for many Russians, doubts never fully disappeared. Still, in 1999, those questions were drowned out by grief and anger. The public demanded a strong response, and Putin delivered it. He called for nothing less than the destruction of Chechen terrorism at its root. His words were echoed by television anchors, repeated in homes, and believed by millions. The bombings, whether by design or by chance, had transformed the political landscape. Putin now stood at the center of it. He was no longer the quiet former spy elevated by Yeltsin as a last-minute choice. He was the man who promised to bring order from chaos, revenge for the dead, and dignity back to Russia. The path was set. The war was coming. On September 30, 1999, 90,000 Russian soldiers crossed the border into Chechnya. The Second Chechen War had begun. By the autumn of 1999, Russia stood on the edge of a cliff. The Dagestan invasion had been crushed. The apartment bombings had left the nation in shock, and Vladimir Putin's voice had risen above the chaos with chilling clarity. He promised not negotiation, not compromise, but war, a war that would restore Russia's dignity through fire and iron. In Grozny, however, Chechen President Aslan Moskadov pleaded for peace. Moskadov was not an extremist. He had fought during the First Chechen War, yes, but he had also signed the Kosovurt Accords, hoping that negotiation could preserve Chechen self-rule while avoiding endless bloodshed. Now, as Russian planes bombed retreating militants and Russian generals prepared for invasion, Moskadov desperately sought dialogue. He sent messages to Moscow, tried repeatedly to speak directly with Yeltsin, even begged for international help. His words fell on deaf ears. The Kremlin had already made its choice. For Putin, negotiation meant weakness, and weakness was unbearable. Russia would not tolerate a rogue republic on its soil, especially one associated in the public imagination with terrorism. Moskodov's pleas were drowned beneath the roar of Russian propaganda and the fury of a population demanding payback. On September 30, 1999, the storm broke. 90,000 Russian soldiers poured across the Terek River, rolling into northern Chechnya with tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, and overwhelming air support. Villages were given ultimatums: expel the rebels or be declared terrorist strongholds and reduced to rubble. Some communities fled into the mountains. Others submitted in silence. Many were destroyed regardless. Unlike the disastrous First Chechen War, the Russian military now relied on brutal simplicity. They avoided close-quarters fighting when possible, preferring to pound every suspected hideout with artillery and airstrikes before infantry advanced. Columns of refugees streamed south, their faces marked with terror as Russian rockets reduced villages to ash. By early November, the Russian army had captured Gudrunsk, Chechnya's second-largest city, and was advancing steadily toward Grozny. This time, they were determined not to repeat their past mistakes. No reckless rush into the capital, no underestimation of resistance. Instead, they surrounded the city, cutting it off, preparing to grind it down through sheer attrition. Inside Grozny, Chechen fighters steeled themselves. They had seen this before. They remembered 1994 when their small bands had humiliated the mighty Russian army in the streets, turning tanks into smoldering wrecks and soldiers into terrified prey. They would do it again or die trying. Moskodov urged restraint, still clinging to the hope of a negotiated peace. But his authority was slipping. Warlords like Basayev and Khattab rallied volunteers, foreign fighters, and hardened veterans, preparing the capital for a siege of unimaginable intensity. As Russian shells began to fall on Grozny's outskirts, the world looked on with unease. International observers warned of catastrophe. Human rights groups pleaded for restraint, but Putin was unyielding. Every explosion, every column of smoke rising from the Chechen capital was not a tragedy in his words but proof that Russia was finally standing tall again. The die was cast. Negotiation was dead. The Second Chechen War was no longer just a military campaign. It was a crusade of national identity. For Russia, it was about erasing the shame of the 1990s and proving that the Federation would not break apart. For Chechnya, it was once again about survival, dignity, and resistance. And at the heart of it all stood Vladimir Putin, the man who had turned terror into opportunity and war into his pathway to power. The battle for Grozny, the most brutal city siege since World War II, was about to begin. As the winter of 1999 closed in, Grozny stood at the center of the storm once more. The capital of Chechnya, already scarred from the First War, was about to endure a second and even more merciless attack. Russian troops, hardened by the Dagestan campaign and encouraged by the public's thirst for revenge, marched steadily toward the city. Behind them trailed columns of tanks, artillery batteries, and supply convoys. Overhead, the sky was filled with the whine of fighter jets and the thunder of bombers. But this was not the reckless charge of 1994. This time, the Russian High Command had learned a cruel lesson. City combat was a trap. Grozny's maze of streets, cellars, and high-rises had devoured Russian columns once before. Now, instead of rushing headlong into ambushes, they would grind the city into dust from a distance. The new strategy was as brutal as it was effective. Entire neighborhoods were mapped into sectors, each to be scouted, then flattened with artillery and aerial bombing. Only after the ground had been turned into rubble would infantry advance, supported by tanks and armored vehicles. It was a methodical destruction, slow, merciless, and devastating. In the villages surrounding Grozny, Russian officers delivered cold ultimatums to local elders. Expel the rebels yourselves, or your homes will be declared terrorist bases and destroyed. Some complied. Others fled into the mountains with their families, carrying only what they could. Still others resisted, and their settlements were destroyed in fire and smoke. For civilians, there was no safety. Whether in the countryside or the capital, they were caught in the iron jaws of war. By November 1999, Russian forces had crossed the Terek River and captured Gudrunsk, Chechnya's second-largest city. They moved steadily west and south, tightening the noose around Grozny. To the Russian public, State television showed images of triumphant soldiers raising flags, columns of tanks rolling forward, villages liberated. But the truth was grimmer. Resistance was everywhere, and casualties mounted daily. Chechen fighters ambushed convoys, slipped behind Russian lines at night, and melted away into the ruins. Inside Grozny, preparations for the siege were frantic. Chechen commanders, many veterans of the First War, organized defensive positions with ruthless efficiency. Snipers occupied upper floors of apartment blocks. Mines were planted along likely approach routes. Civilians, terrified yet unable to leave, dug makeshift shelters in basements, clutching children as artillery shells screamed overhead. Shamil Basayev and Ibn al-Khattab commanded groups of fighters hardened by years of guerrilla war, their resolve undiminished despite being vastly outnumbered. By December, the Russian army had fully surrounded the city. Supply routes were cut. Electricity and water were scarce. The siege was on. For nearly 2 months, Grozny was subjected to relentless bombing. Rockets, mortars, and heavy artillery rained down day and night, transforming entire districts into unrecognizable wastelands. At times, it seemed less a city than a graveyard of shattered buildings and smoldering ruins. Yet the Chechens fought on. At night, they launched daring raids on Russian positions, often disguised in captured uniforms. By day, they harassed advancing infantry with sniper fire and ambushes. For Russian soldiers, every corner, every darkened stairwell, every cellar doorway was a potential death trap. Morale began to fray. The army's overwhelming firepower gave it control over territory but not security. The Russian public, however, saw only victory. State media broadcast glowing reports of progress, districts secured, enemy forces collapsing, the capital on the verge of liberation. Putin, now the face of the war effort, used the story to his advantage. He portrayed the campaign as proof that Russia was once again strong, disciplined, and determined. For ordinary Russians tired of humiliation, the story was intoxicating. But behind the propaganda, the truth was far darker. Grozny was being erased block by block, street by street. Civilians trapped inside described a hellscape of fire, rubble, and death. International observers would later call the bombing one of the most destructive attacks on a city since World War II. The stage was set for the battle to come. Russia had surrounded Grozny, preparing to storm it with overwhelming firepower. The Chechens, outnumbered and outgunned, had nothing left but courage, cunning, and the will to resist. The siege was not only a fight for control of a city. It was a struggle for Russia's pride and Chechnya's survival. And as the shells continued to fall, both sides understood one truth. Grozny would not be taken without becoming a graveyard first. The winter of 1999 came down upon Grozny like a blanket. The Chechen capital, already battered from weeks of bombing, now lay under constant fire. By December, the Russian army had drawn its noose tight around the city. Every road in and out was sealed. Every village on the outskirts was defeated or destroyed. Inside, tens of thousands of civilians huddled in cellars, basements, and makeshift shelters, waiting for the next shell to fall. The Russian plan was ruthless in its precision. Grozny was divided into 15 sectors, each to be reduced systematically. Scout units identified strong points. Artillery and bombers destroyed them. When the ruins were deemed safe, sapper units created narrow corridors for advancing infantry. These corridors were not meant for rescue. They were pathways for conquest. The first probes into the city began in late December. Russian tanks rumbled forward, escorted by infantry and supported by armored personnel carriers and BMP fighting vehicles. Yet even amidst the wreckage, the Chechens struck back. Snipers fired from shattered high-rises. Ambushes erupted from cellars. At night, fighters slipped through tunnels, disguising themselves in Russian uniforms to get into enemy positions. The city itself seemed to work against the invaders. For Russian troops, the experience was terrifying. Every street corner held danger. Every stairwell hid a rifle. The Chechens had prepared Grozny as a death trap, knowing they could not match Russia in numbers or firepower but determined to make them pay at every turn. As the army advanced, its progress was measured not in territory gained but in lives lost. Entire platoons vanished in ambushes, their vehicles left smoldering husks in the snow. Yet the Russian command adapted. Instead of storming strongholds directly, they buried them beneath fire. Mortar batteries and rocket launchers flattened entire blocks. The terrifying RPOA Schmel flamethrower, capable of burning rooms with a single blast, was unleashed without restraint. Civilians trapped in basements died alongside fighters. For Moscow, these were acceptable costs. For the people of Grozny, it was apocalypse. By January 2000, the battle reached its most desperate phase. Minutka Square, surrounded by 9-story buildings that provided ideal positions for snipers, became the heart of the struggle. Long-range duels between sharpshooters echoed through the frozen streets, broken by frantic close-quarters combat when Chechens emerged from tunnels to attack Russian lines. Buildings changed hands daily. The tallest tower in the city was seized, lost, and seized again, each time at terrible cost. The destruction was almost unimaginable. Entire districts were reduced to fields of rubble. Fires raged uncontrolled, lighting the night sky with an orange glow. The smell of smoke, explosives, and decay clung to the air. International observers later declared Grozny the most destroyed city in Europe since the Second World War. For those inside, comparisons to Stalingrad felt grimly accurate. Russian state media, however, painted a different picture. Reports spoke of swift progress, of collapsing Chechen resistance, of victory at hand. Putin's image was carefully woven into the story: strong, decisive, unyielding. He visited troops, spoke with authority, and declared that Russia was restoring its honor. To the public, starved for good news, it was intoxicating. For Putin, it was a masterstroke. His popularity soared. But on the ground, the truth was chaos. Russian troops complained of not enough support. Militia units loyal to Moscow accused the army of abandoning them in the midst of battles. Civilians begged for safe passage, only to be turned back or caught in crossfire. For the Chechens, each day of survival was a victory, proof that their spirit could outlast even the most merciless bombing. The siege of Grozny was not only a military struggle. It was psychological warfare. For Russia, it was about proving that the humiliation of the First War would not be repeated. For Chechnya, it was about showing that even in the face of overwhelming firepower, defiance could not be extinguished. By late January, however, the defenders' strength began to fail. Supplies were running low. Ammunition was scarce. And yet, Basayev and his commanders prepared for one last desperate gamble, a breakout through the Russian encirclement. They would not surrender. If Grozny fell, it would not fall quietly. As Grozny burned under Russian shells, another drama was unfolding in Moscow, one that would permanently reshape Russia's destiny. The war in Chechnya was not just a military campaign. It was the stage upon which a new leader was stepping into the spotlight. For nearly a decade, Boris Yeltsin had clung to the presidency, his authority worn down by illness, alcoholism, and scandal. His once defiant image, standing on a tank in 1991, praised as the man who defied the old Soviet order, had faded into mockery. By 1999, he was visibly exhausted, his approval ratings terribly low, his enemies circling like vultures. The Kremlin had become a fortress under siege, not by foreign armies but by rival businessmen and ambitious politicians eager to inherit the ruins of a broken state. In this atmosphere of decline, Vladimir Putin appeared as the opposite of Yeltsin. Where Yeltsin stumbled, Putin walked with measured discipline. Where Yeltsin appeared frail, Putin projected the image of strength. And above all, Putin offered the one thing Russians craved: strength. His firm stance on Chechnya, his promises of order and payback, resonated with a people weary of humiliation. By late 1999, Yeltsin faced a dilemma. If he resigned, he risked prosecution from his many enemies. If he remained, his declining health threatened to leave Russia adrift. He needed a successor who would protect him, his family, and the network of allies that had kept him in power. In Putin, he found the perfect candidate: loyal, ambitious, and, at least at first glance, controllable. In December 1999, Yeltsin summoned Putin to his private residence. The two men struck a deal. Yeltsin would step down, but in return, Putin would guarantee immunity from prosecution for the outgoing president and his family. It was a pact sealed not only in politics but in survival. On New Year's Eve, as the world prepared to welcome the new millennium, Russia awoke to stunning news. Boris Yeltsin had resigned. In his televised address, he apologized to the Russian people for failing to build the nation they deserved. With shaking hands and tired eyes, he announced that he was handing power to Vladimir Putin, who would serve as acting president until elections in March. The contrast was stark. That very evening, Putin appeared in Dagestan, addressing soldiers with the poise of a commander. His words were sharp and unwavering. Russia would not fail. Russia would not break apart. Russia would rise again. This is not just about restoring Russia's honor and dignity, he declared. It's about putting an end to the breakup of the Russian Federation. To a nation demoralized by economic collapse, crime, and humiliation, these words struck like thunder. Russians who had never heard his name a year earlier now saw in Putin the image of a hero. He was young, disciplined, and above all, decisive. Where Yeltsin had embodied chaos, Putin embodied control. Meanwhile, Grozny was collapsing under fire. Russian troops pushed deeper into the ruins, their progress measured by bodies and rubble. Each advance was celebrated in the media as proof of Putin's leadership, as if the destruction of the Chechen capital was itself a symbol of Russia's rebirth. The war was brutal, bloody, and merciless, but in the eyes of many Russians, it was also necessary. By the time the year 2000 dawned, Vladimir Putin was no longer a shadowy government worker from the KGB. He was the acting president of the Russian Federation, commander of its armies, and the man who promised to restore what had been lost in the wreckage of the Soviet collapse. His rise was meteoric, his authority built not through decades of statesmanship but through fire, war, and the hunger of a wounded nation. In Moscow, the Kremlin stood unchanged in its shape, but inside its walls, power had shifted. Russia's future now belonged to Vladimir Putin. By January 2000, Grozny had become a graveyard. Entire districts were reduced to rubble, their skeletal remains blackened by fire and smoke. For weeks, the city had endured the thunder of Russian artillery, the scream of jets, and the relentless grind of armored columns. The Chechen defenders had fought fiercely, turning every ruin into a fortress, every basement into a bunker. But no force, however determined, could withstand the sheer weight of Russia's firepower forever. On January 29, the Chechens attempted the impossible. Under the command of Shamil Basayev and Aslan Moskadov senior officers, thousands of fighters and civilians prepared for a breakout through the Russian encirclement. It was a desperate gamble, escape or die where they stood. In the freezing night, they moved in columns across minefields, carrying the wounded on their backs, guiding one another through paths marked hastily by Basayev's men. Explosions lit the darkness as mines tore through the fleeing groups. But most managed to break free, limping into the mountains that had sheltered their ancestors for centuries. The cost was horrible. Basayev himself lost part of his leg to a mine. Hundreds of Chechens died in the attempt, but for the survivors, escape meant the chance to continue the fight. Grozny, however, was lost. Russian forces raised their flags over the ruins, declaring victory. To Moscow, it was the ultimate symbol. The capital of rebellious Chechnya had been crushed beneath Russian steel. For Aslan Moskadov, the retreat was a devastating blow. He had hoped to hold Grozny long enough to negotiate, to prove that Chechnya still had leverage. But the breakout shattered that illusion. His voice, once that of a president, now carried little weight. Authority slipped from his hands to the warlords who thrived in chaos. Men like Basayev and Ibn al-Khattab, who embraced guerrilla tactics and holy war. The Second Chechen War was far from over. It had merely changed form. With Grozny occupied, the conflict moved to the mountains and forests of southern Chechnya. Russian troops spread across the countryside, conducting cleansing operations in villages suspected of harboring rebels. These sweeps often descended into brutality. Homes burned, men disappeared, families terrorized. Moscow framed it as counter-terrorism. For Chechens, it was collective punishment. The rebels adapted. They struck in ambushes, planted roadside bombs, and launched raids under cover of night. Columns of Russian vehicles were blown apart by homemade explosives. Soldiers stationed in isolated outposts lived in constant fear, never knowing when or where the next attack would come. The war had entered its guerrilla phase, one far more difficult to contain than the open battles for cities. Beyond Chechnya's borders, the conflict began to ripple outward. Hundreds of fighters slipped into neighboring Georgia, seeking refuge in the Pankisi Gorge. Moscow, furious, accused Tbilisi of harboring terrorists and launched airstrikes across the border, an unmistakable signal that Russia would punish even passive cooperation with Chechen rebels. The message was clear: Putin's Russia would not hesitate to project power beyond its borders. Internationally, Chechnya found itself increasingly isolated. Western governments, wary of upsetting Moscow, issued cautious condemnations but offered little real support. Human rights groups documented atrocities, but their reports were drowned out by Russia's story of fighting terrorism. The timing was important, as global attention shifted toward terrorism at the turn of the millennium. Chechen rebels lost sympathy, their cause stained by association with extremists. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Putin's star continued to rise. The war was brutal, yes, but it was also portrayed as decisive. Russian state media framed each advance, each captured village, each rebel killed as a personal victory for the new leader. To many Russians, weary of a decade of weakness, Putin was proving that the Federation still had teeth. In Chechnya, however, the struggle had entered a darker, more desperate chapter. No longer a fight for cities, it became a war of shadows, ambushes, terror, and paybacks, fought in forests, mountains, and ruined villages. For the Russian army, it was a grinding nightmare. For the Chechens, it was survival by any means necessary. The capital was lost, but the war was far from over. The fall of Grozny in early 2000 did not end the war. It only reshaped it. For the Kremlin, the capture of the Chechen capital was praised as a decisive victory, the final crushing of separatist defiance. State television showed images of Russian flags raised over smoldering ruins, proclaiming that order had been restored. But in reality, the war was slipping into a more dangerous and sneaky phase, one that would bleed Russia for years. The Chechen resistance did not vanish. It dissolved into the mountains, forests, and ravines of the North Caucasus. Fighters abandoned the ruined cities and reorganized into small, mobile units. They struck suddenly, ambushing convoys on mountain roads, planting roadside bombs, and raiding military outposts under the cover of darkness. For Russian soldiers, every patrol became a gamble with death. Mines hidden beneath dirt tracks could destroy armored vehicles in an instant. Snipers stalked soldiers from unseen ridges. Even routine supply missions risked turning into massacres. In the villages, Moscow unleashed Zakistki, cleansing operations meant to root out rebels and their supporters. Russian troops would storm settlements, rounding up men for questioning, often making them disappear into the void of secret detention centers. Families were left without fathers, sons, or brothers. Homes were looted, burned, or destroyed. Human rights organizations documented hundreds of cases of torture and extrajudicial killings. For the Chechen people, life itself became an act of survival between two merciless forces, insurgents demanding loyalty and Russians demanding submission. Aslan Moskadov, still recognized by many as Chechnya's legitimate president, struggled to maintain control. His attempts to negotiate, or at least restrain the violence, were constantly sabotaged by extremists within his own ranks. Shamil Basayev and Ibn al-Khattab, encouraged by their reputations as warriors, turned increasingly to terrorism. No longer confined to Chechen soil, their attacks spread across Russia, targeting civilians to sow fear and demonstrate that Moscow could not keep its people safe. One of the most shocking moments came in June 1995 when Basayev led the infamous Budyanovsk hospital siege during the First War, a warning of what was to come. In the Second War, such acts became deadlier and more frequent. Bombings ripped through Russian cities. Suicide attacks struck military bases. In the minds of many Russians, the line between Chechen independence fighters and international jihadists blurred into one shadowy threat: terrorism. The Russian state used this perception. Putin's government carefully framed every attack as proof that Chechnya was not a nation seeking self-rule but a nest of terrorists threatening Russia's very existence. The language shifted. The war was no longer about separatism but about survival. And in this new framing, brutality was justified. For Russian soldiers on the ground, however, the war was a slow nightmare. Casualty lists mounted steadily. Young soldiers, many from poor villages in Russia's heartland, were buried without ceremony, their families receiving little more than condolences and small compensation. Morale sank. Alcohol and corruption spread through the ranks. Units grew paranoid, sometimes lashing out at civilians in frustration, deepening the cycle of violence. For Chechnya, hope of outside support evaporated. In the mid-1990s, their cause had been viewed in some corners of the world as a struggle for freedom against Russian imperialism. By the early 2000s, the association with terrorism poisoned that image. Kidnappings of foreigners, bombings in Russian cities, and the infiltration of foreign jihadists turned potential allies into wary observers. The Chechen cause, once rooted in nationalism, was now tangled with the global jihadist movement, a shift that would haunt it forever. The war settled into a grim rhythm. Rebels struck, the army struck back, civilians suffered. Villages burned, families fled, and the mountains echoed with the sounds of distant gunfire. To outsiders, the conflict seemed endless, a cycle of violence without resolution. To Putin, however, every month the insurgency dragged on became another opportunity to present himself as the steady hand guiding Russia through chaos. The long war was no longer simply about territory. It was about perception. For Chechens, it became the struggle to exist, even as their homeland was scarred beyond recognition. For Russia, it was about building a story of strength, of a nation that would never again bow to weakness. And in this testing ground of fire, Vladimir Putin's image as Russia's unyielding strongman solidified. The insurgency raged on, but politically it was already serving its purpose. By the early 2000s, the Chechen resistance was caught in a tightening trap. On the ground, they faced a relentless Russian counterinsurgency. Abroad, they struggled to maintain legitimacy in a world growing ever more hostile to their cause. The final blow came not from Moscow but from New York, Washington, and the deserts of Afghanistan. On September 11, 2001, the world changed. The terrorist attacks on the United States redefined global politics, recasting nearly every regional conflict through the lens of the war on terror. For Vladimir Putin, it was an extraordinary opportunity. Within hours of the attacks, he phoned President George W. Bush, not only to offer condolences but to plant a seed. Russia, he suggested, knew the same enemy. The men striking America and the militants in Chechnya were two heads of the same monster. It was a masterstroke. For years, international human rights groups had criticized Russia's conduct in Chechnya, its cleansing operations, mass disappearances, and destruction of entire villages. Western leaders had cautiously voiced concern. But after September 11, the global mood shifted. Counter-terrorism was no longer a regional issue. It was a crusade. And Putin had positioned Russia as a frontline ally. The Chechen struggle, once framed as a war of independence, now found itself branded as part of an international jihad. Moscow amplified every connection between rebels like Basayev and Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda's global network. Foreign fighters in the Caucasus became proof not of solidarity but of terrorism. When Basayev orchestrated spectacular acts of violence, hostage-takings, bombings and raids, he confirmed the Kremlin's story in the eyes of the world. Aslan Moskadov, the elected Chechen president still clinging to the idea of negotiation, was increasingly pushed aside. He insisted that Chechnya's cause was national, not jihadist. But his words carried little weight against the images broadcast worldwide: explosions, masked gunmen, children fleeing from schools under fire. The Chechen movement fractured, its moderate voices drowned out by the extremists who dominated the battlefield. Isolation followed. Western governments, once critical of Russian heavy-handedness, now quietly shifted stance. Washington, London, Berlin, each had its own war on terror to fight. Moscow's brutality in Chechnya was tolerated, even excused, under the logic of counter-terrorism. Chechnya's plight was reduced to a footnote in global politics, overshadowed by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. For Chechens, this abandonment was crushing. Their hopes of international recognition, of diplomatic pressure on Russia, evaporated. In exile, Ichkerian representatives were treated as outcasts. Within Chechnya itself, Russia tightened its grip, installing loyalist militias and conducting operations with near total impunity. For Putin, the timing was perfect. He had transformed a messy, unpopular war into part of a righteous global struggle. No longer the aggressor crushing a rebellious republic, he was now the defender of civilization against terror. This framing not only silenced international critics but also strengthened his image at home. Russians, watching the horrors of 9/11 and its aftermath, felt vindicated. Their suffering from terrorism was now part of a shared global reality. The shadow of 9/11 thus cast Chechnya into isolation. Its war for independence was recast as a terrorist insurgency. Its leaders were hunted, its people broken, and its cause delegitimized. And in Moscow, Vladimir Putin stood taller than ever, a leader who had not only crushed rebellion at home but had aligned Russia with the defining struggle of the new century. Chechnya had become a battlefield abandoned by the world. And in that abandonment, Putin found victory. By the mid-2000s, the flames of open war in Chechnya had dimmed, but the smoke of devastation lingered over the Caucasus. Grozny, once a bustling city, had been reduced to a skeletal ruin. Villages lay in ashes, their names remembered only in lists of cleansing operations. The official Russian story was simple: victory had been won. Yet beneath that triumph lay a deeper truth. The Second Chechen War had reshaped not only Chechnya but Russia itself. Putin's strategy after Grozny's fall was as political as it was military. Rather than rely indefinitely on Russian troops, he sought to build a loyalist government within Chechnya. In 2003, Moscow installed Akhmad Kadyrov, a former rebel mufti who had defected to the Russian side, as president. Under his rule, a referendum conducted under heavy Russian military presence formally reintegrated Chechnya into the Russian Federation. The result was predictable, the process tightly controlled. For Moscow, it was presented as the final step in normalizing the republic. But power in Chechnya was fragile, and loyalty came at a cost. In 2004, Akhmad Kadyrov was assassinated in a bombing at Grozny Stadium. The Kremlin reacted swiftly, grooming his son, Ramzan Kadyrov, to inherit his role. Young, brutal and ambitious, Ramzan would eventually become Moscow's iron hand in the region, ruling Chechnya with a mix of gifts, fear, and personal militias loyal only to him. Under his command, Grozny was rebuilt, its skyline filled with glittering towers and neon lights, a display of modernization masking the memory of its destruction. For the insurgency, the 2000s were years of steady decline. Moskodov, once the president of independent Ichkeria, was killed by Russian forces in 2005. Shamil Basayev, the face of Chechen militancy, died in 2006 when explosives went off early in his convoy. Khattab had been killed earlier, poisoned in a Russian intelligence operation. One by one, the leaders who had defined the resistance were hunted down, their deaths praised as proof of Moscow's never-ending determination. And yet, even with its leaders gone, the insurgency never completely disappeared. Scattered cells continued to operate in the mountains, staging ambushes, bombings, and raids. Their influence spread beyond Chechnya, igniting conflicts across the North Caucasus, in Ingushetia, Dagestan, and beyond. What had begun as a war for independence had spread into a broader jihadist insurgency, when increasingly divorced from Chechnya's original nationalist cause. The cost of the war was staggering. Conservative estimates put Russian military losses at around 7,000. Chechen combatant deaths were double that. But the civilian toll dwarfed them both. Tens of thousands dead, entire communities uprooted, lives shattered. The ruins of Grozny were more than a symbol of Russian firepower. They were a monument to human suffering on an immense scale. For Russia, however, the political outcome was clear. The Second Chechen War cemented Vladimir Putin's rule. The image of a strong leader who had restored order, crushed separatism, and defended the Federation became the foundation of his presidency. In the 2000 election, he won decisively, riding a wave of popularity built on the war's brutal victories. From then on, Putin would use the Chechen conflict as proof of his strength, a reminder to both his allies and his enemies that he was willing to use any means necessary to preserve the state. The legacy of the Second Chechen War is therefore twofold. For Chechnya, it meant survival at the cost of freedom, rebuilding under authoritarian rule, and a society scarred by war and repression. For Russia, it meant the rebirth of centralized power, the rise of a leader who transformed defeat into control, and a blueprint for governance built on control, force, and the silencing of dissent. Even today, the echoes of that war remain. Chechnya exists within Russia, not as a reconciled region but as a reminder of the price of resistance. Putin exists as Russia's strongman, not despite the Chechen War but because of it. The ruins of Grozny may have been rebuilt with gleaming towers, but the memory of what happened there is woven into the foundations of modern Russia. The Second Chechen War did not simply end with the fall of a city. It ended with the rise of a man, and with it, the shaping of a Russia that endures to this day.